The mahogany double doors of the Seoul estate swung open on silent hinges. Baek Doo-kyun stepped into the foyer, his silhouette framed by the dying amber light of the courtyard. He moved with the unhurried grace of a man who owned the silence, a boss who had spent 15 years turning his name into a synonym for consequence. His tailored black suit was crisp, his neck tattoo a dark shadow against a white collar, and for once, he sought the quiet of his own sanctuary before the evening's council meeting. He crossed the marble floor, the echoes of his footsteps the only sound in the cavernous hall. He was home. He was safe. Then, the world tilted. A blur of movement erupted from the cloakroom shadows. Before Doo-kyun could reach for the weapon at his hip, a pair of striking, crimson-red rubber gloves clamped over his mouth. The grip was startlingly strong, not the frantic grab of an amateur, but the calculated anchor of someone who had practiced this moment in her mind for months. His back slammed against the ornate wood paneling of a narrow crawlspace door. A voice, sharp with an American accent and low with bone-chilling urgency, hissed into his ear. "If you make a sound, you're a dead man. Watch. Look at what you've been trusting." Nyamai called her. The maid. The woman who usually moved like a ghost through his peripheral vision, as invisible as the dust she cleaned. She dragged him backward into the darkness of the crawlspace, her hand never wavering from his lips. She held the door open just a fraction, a sliver of light illuminating the horror about to unfold. Through the gap, Doo-kyun saw the light in his private study flicker on. Han Eol, his most trusted lieutenant, the man he called little brother, walked in, leaning casually against Doo-kyun's desk. Beside him stood the head of the syndicate's council. They weren't discussing business, they were sharing a toast of expensive scotch. Han Eol reached for the small porcelain vial of traditional herbal tonic that sat on the desk, the tonic Doo-kyun drank religiously every afternoon for vitality. Han Eol swirled the dark liquid, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. "How much longer until the great dragon finally stops breathing?" Han Eol asked, his voice dripping with mockery. The council leader laughed, a hollow, grating sound. "The arsenic is cumulative. Another 2 doses and his heart will simply stop. No struggle, no suspicion. Just a tragic end to a long reign." Han Eol set the vial back down, his eyes cold. "By the time the moon is high, the estate belongs to me. And Doo-kyun. He'll be just another memory buried in the dirt." Inside the shadows, the man who was used to being feared felt the first true chill of terror. The red gloves on his mouth weren't a threat, they were the only thing keeping him from screaming into the void of his own betrayal. The darkness of the crawlspace smelled of cedar and old dust, a suffocating contrast to the clinical scent of the traditional herbs that usually drifted from his study. Doo-kyun's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird, each thud vibrating against Nyamai's palm. Her red gloves were cold against his skin, but her grip was steady, an anchor in a world that had just dissolved into a nightmare. Through the 2-inch gap in the door, the opulence of his home felt like a theater set, one where the actors had finally dropped their masks. Han Eol, the man Doo-kyun had plucked from the gutters of Busan and raised as his own, stood by the mahogany desk. He looked different in the light of betrayal, sharper, uglier. He held a small, translucent vial, tapping it against the rim of Doo-kyun's porcelain teacup. The dark, viscous herbal tonic sat waiting, a daily ritual Doo-kyun had trusted for his supposed recovery from exhaustion. "The old man is late," Han Eol remarked, his voice devoid of the deference he had worn for a decade. He uncorked the vial with a casual flick of his thumb. "He's usually so eager for his strength to return. He has no idea that every sip is just another nail in the coffin." Doo-kyun watched, paralyzed, as a clear liquid dripped into the tonic. It vanished instantly, a silent assassin merging with the bitter herbs. The council leader, a man who had bowed to Doo-kyun only yesterday, leaned forward with a predatory gleam in his eyes. "The beauty of arsenic, Han Eol, is the patience it requires. By the time his heart gives out, the doctors will find nothing but the natural progression of a stressed man's decline. We aren't just taking his throne, we are making it look like he was too weak to sit on it." A cold sweat broke across Doo-kyun's brow. The exhaustion he had been feeling, the tremors in his hands, the sudden bouts of nausea, the fog in his mind, wasn't the weight of his empire. It was the weight of Haniel's hand. Every morning, he thanked this man for the medicine. Every morning, he had swallowed his own death. Beside him, Niamai's breathing was shallow, rhythmic. She didn't look at the betrayal, she looked only at Dukyun, her eyes wide and urgent. She had seen this play out for weeks, documenting the silent murder while he played the role of the oblivious king. The bitter tonic was no longer just a drink, it was a revelation. His home was not a sanctuary, and his blood brother was a parasite. In the suffocating quiet of the shadows, Baek Dukyun realized that the dragon hadn't been resting, he had been served for dinner. The heavy mahogany door of the study clicked shut, and for a moment, the only sound in the crawlspace was the frantic, uneven rhythm of Dukyun's breath. Niamai didn't release him immediately. She waited, her head tilted, listening to the muffled receding footsteps of the men who had just signed his death warrant. When she finally pulled her hand away, the air felt cold where a red glove had been. "We have 3 minutes before the security rotation hits the West Wing," she whispered, her voice a low, disciplined vibration. She didn't wait for his permission. She turned, pushing aside a stack of linens to reveal a small, latchless panel integrated into the molding. Dukyun, the man who had designed this estate as an impenetrable fortress, stared in stunned silence. He had spent millions on biometric scanners and thermal sensors, yet he was being led through a vein of his own house he never knew existed. Niamai moved with a predatory efficiency, slipping into a narrow, dimly lit shaft where the smell of industrial grease and stale air replaced the scent of expensive lilies. "This is the ventilation and laundry spine," she explained without looking back, her red gloves appearing like splashes of blood in the gloom as she navigated a steep iron ladder. "Your blood brother has the front gates and the elevators locked down. He thinks he's trapped a dragon in a cage, but he forgot about the people who actually keep this place running." Dukyun followed, his expensive Italian shoes scraping awkwardly against the metal rungs. The physical exertion sent a spike of nausea through him, the cumulative effect of the arsenic clawing at his insides. He stumbled, his vision blurring, but Niamai's hand was suddenly there, anchoring his arm with a strength that belied her frame. "Focus, Beck," she hissed, using his name with a bluntness that would have earned a man a bullet an hour ago. "If you fall here, you're just trash in a chute. We go down through the incinerator bypass and out through the loading docks. The trash pickup is in 5 minutes. That's our window." As they moved deeper into the bowels of the estate, passing the humming vibrating hearts of the HVAC units and the churning water pipes, Dukyun felt the shift. Up there, in the marble halls, he was a god. Down here, amidst the dust and the machinery, he was a ghost. He was seeing his empire from the underside, the dirty, hidden, and essential parts he had always looked down upon. Niamai wasn't just leading him out of a building, she was leading him out of his own myth. When they finally reached the heavy steel door of the loading dock, the cool night air of Seoul hissed through the gap, smelling of exhaust and freedom. The damp air of the alleyway hit Dukyun like a physical reprimand, sharp and smelling of wet asphalt. They were less than a block from his estate, yet the distance felt astronomical. Niamai stopped beside a rusting green dumpster, her red gloves a startling contrast against the grime of the industrial zone. She didn't look at the sprawling fortress they had just fled, she looked at his wrist. "That watch," she whispered, pointing to the Patek Philippe that shimmered even in the low light of the street lamps. "It has a GPS tether, doesn't it? And your phone, the biometric one." Dukyun looked down at his wrist. The watch was worth more than a mid-sized apartment, a custom piece that had always felt like a part of his anatomy. It was a symbol of his habitual power, a ticking reminder of every minute he had spent ruling the city. But now, it was a homing beacon for Haniel's executioners. His fingers, slightly numb from the arsenic, fumbled with the clasp. "It's not just a watch," he muttered, his voice raspy. "In 5 minutes, it's a death warrant," Niamai countered. She held out a small, lead-lined pouch she had snatched from the security room during their flight. "Give them to me. All of it. The ring, the phone, the cufflinks. Anything that connects you to Baek Dukyun." He hesitated. To strip away these things was to strip away the only identity he had known since his 20s. Without the suit, the ink, and the steel on his wrist, he was just a man with a failing liver and a price on his head. But he looked into Nyimai's eyes, wide, alert, and devoid of the deference he had always demanded, and he saw the truth. He was dead weight if he stayed the man he was. The watch hit the bottom of the pouch with a heavy, final thud. He followed it with his encrypted phone and the platinum signet ring that bore the crest of his syndicate. As the pouch zipped shut, Do-kyun felt a strange, terrifying lightness. He reached up, pulling his silk tie loose and tossing it into the darkness of the dumpster. The dark tattoo on his neck felt exposed, a permanent scar of a violent past, but for the first time, it didn't feel like armor. Nyimai tucked the pouch deep into the trash, burying his legacy under layers of urban decay. "The dragon is dead," she said, her voice anchoring him to the cold reality of the street. "Now, let's see if the men can survive the night." They turned away from the light of the estate, disappearing into the shadows of a soul that didn't know his name, leaving the gilded cage behind forever. The taxi ride had been a blur of neon lights and nausea, the city's skyline retreating until the gleaming towers of Gangnam were replaced by the low-slung, weathered facades of a district that didn't appear on any of the maps in Do-kyun's boardroom. This was the fringe of the city, a labyrinth of narrow alleys draped in a spiderweb of low-hanging electrical wires and the scent of frying oil and exhaust. Nyimai stepped out of the car first, her red gloves finally tucked away in her pockets, replaced by a nondescript hooded jacket. Do-kyun followed, his legs feeling like leaden weights. As he stood on the cracked pavement, he felt a profound sense of displacement. In his world, every street corner was a data point on a ledger, every building owned by a shell company he controlled. But here, the air felt different, thick with a life that was chaotic, unrecorded, and utterly indifferent to his name. "Welcome to the shadow sector," Nyimai said, her voice losing its frantic edge and gaining a quiet authority. "Your syndicate doesn't come here. There's no money to be made from people who have nothing, so they don't bother with the cameras or the informants." Do-kyun looked around at the flickering fluorescent signs of bodegas and the groups of men sitting on plastic crates, their eyes tracking the strangers with a weary, sharp intelligence. He was impeccably dressed, even with his tie gone and his shirt unbuttoned, but he felt more naked than he ever had in his life. The dark tattoo on his neck, usually a badge of lethal status, was just another mark in a neighborhood full of scars. They walked past a row of cramped apartment blocks where the laundry hung like prayer flags from rusted balconies. This was a place built on the grid of survival, a communal fortress where the residents looked out for one another because the system certainly wouldn't. Do-kyun realized that his power was a currency that had no exchange rate here. He couldn't command respect with a look, he couldn't threaten with a gesture. He was just a sick man being led by a woman who knew the terrain. As Nyimai led him toward a nondescript steel door at the end of a dead-end alley, the realization settled in his gut alongside the poison. He had spent his life building walls to keep the world out, but he had ended up building a prison for himself. Here, in the shadows of the city he thought he ruled, he was finally starting to see the world as it actually was, and it was terrifyingly vast. Nyimai fumbled for a key, her face illuminated by a single, buzzing street lamp. "In here," she whispered. "The rules of the Great Dragon don't apply past this threshold. From now on, you're just a guest in my world." The apartment was small, smelling of lemon floor wax and old paper, a stark contrast to the sterile, jasmine-scented air of the penthouse. Nyimai didn't offer him a seat, she went straight to a loose floorboard beneath her small dining table. When she stood, she held a battered, leather-bound notebook. She laid it on the table between them like a formal indictment. "You called me a ghost in your house, Beck," she said, her voice steady as she flipped to the first page. "But ghosts see everything because nobody bothers to hide from the furniture." Do-kyun leaned forward, his hands trembling as he stared at the handwriting. It was a meticulous log. Dates, times, fragments of overheard conversations, and even photos taped to the margins. It was a journal of the invisible, a ledger of every shadow that had moved behind his back while he sat on his throne. He saw a photo of Han Eol meeting with the rival council leader in the estate's own gardens, a meeting that had supposedly never happened. He read transcripts of hushed phone calls made from his own kitchen, detailing the gradual increase of the arsenic in his tonics. There were even sketches of the security blind spots Han Eol had created to move illicit shipments through Do-kyun's docks. 3 months, Do-kyun whispered, his voice cracking. You've known for 3 months. I tried to tell you, Nyamai said, her eyes flashing with a sudden, sharp anger. I dropped a tray in front of you when Haniol was whispering in the hall. I left the pantry door open so you'd see them. You didn't even look at me. You just told me to clean up the mess and stay out of your sight. The realization hit him harder than the poison. His strategic blindness hadn't just been a personality flaw, it had been his greatest security breach. He had cultivated an environment where the people who served him were so marginalized that their warnings were indistinguishable from background noise. He flipped to the final page. It was a list of names, men he considered loyal, men who had eaten at his table, all marked with a single, chilling word, compromised. They didn't just want your chair, Nyamai said, closing the book with a soft thud. They wanted to erase you so completely that even the history books would forget you existed. I didn't save you because I owe you, Beck. I saved you because I couldn't stand to watch another monster win just because a goodman was too arrogant to look down. For the first time in his life, Dukyun felt small. The ledger was more than evidence, it was a mirror. And for the first time, he didn't recognize the men staring back. The following days were a descent into a private purgatory. The arsenic didn't leave his body quietly, it clawed its way out, leaving Dukyun shivering beneath a threadbare quilt in Nyamai's cramped guest room. The fever came in waves, melting the walls of the apartment until he was no longer in the shadow sector, but back in the dark garden of his youth, burying a bird he couldn't save, or standing on the deck of a ship watching his father disappear into the mist. In his delirium, the great dragon was reduced to a gasping shadow. He felt the cold press of a damp cloth against his forehead and the steadying presence of Nyamai's hands, no longer encased in red rubber, but warm and calloused. She stayed by his side through the worst of the tremors, forcing spoonfuls of charcoal-infused broth between his cracked lips. Drink, she commanded, her voice a calm anchor in the sea of his hallucinations. Your body needs to purge the rot Haniol fed you. If you give up now, the poison wins. Dukyun gripped her wrist, his strength a mere fraction of what it once was. Why, he rasped, his eyes bloodshot and unfocused. I am nothing to you. A paycheck. A ghost. Nyamai didn't flinch. She wrung out the cloth and replaced it on his brow. Because for 3 months, I watched you die in a house full of people who called you brother. I watched you eat poison served with a smile. No one should go out like that, Beck. Not even a man who forgot how to look people in the eye. The vulnerability was a physical weight, heavier than the sickness. For the first time in 20 years, Dukyun was utterly dependent on the mercy of another. There were no guards to call, no lawyers to bribe, no soldiers to command. He was just a man, stripped of his suit and his myth, fighting for breath in a room that smelled of lavender and sweat. As the fever finally began to break on the third night, he watched Nyamai sleep in a chair by the door, a kitchen knife tucked into the waistband of her jeans, her own version of a sentry. He realized then that he had spent his life building a world where loyalty was a transaction, yet here he was, being saved by the only person he had never paid for anything more than chores. The rot was leaving his system, but as he looked at the humble ceiling above him, he knew the man who had entered this room was never coming back. The stillness of the shadow sector was shattered not by a siren, but by the rhythmic, heavy thud of boots on the stairs, a sound Dukyun had once directed like a conductor. Haniol's enforcers hadn't found them through GPS or high-tech surveillance, they had found them through the primitive persistence of a street sweep. Through the thin wood of the apartment door, the low murmur of voices carried a lethal familiarity. Check every unit. The American girl's place is on this floor, a voice commanded. Dukyun stood in the center of the kitchen, his legs still trembling from the lingering poison, his chest tight. For the first time in his life, he reached for a weapon and found no cold steel of a customized handgun. His tailored holster was gone, replaced by the weight of a heavy cast-iron skillet Nyamai had left on the stove. He felt a surge of bitter irony. The King of Ash, reduced to defending his life with cookware. Nyamai was at the window, peering through the slats of the rusted blinds. They're on the fire escape too, she whispered, her face illuminated by the flickering red of a neon sign outside. She didn't look afraid, she looked focused, her hand gripped around a sharpened screwdriver. You're not a boss right now, Beck. You're just a man in a room. Can you do this? I've spent 20 years telling others to do it for me, Do-kyun rasped, adjusting his grip on the iron handle. I suppose it's time I remembered how. The door didn't yield to a knock, it exploded inward under the force of a tactical kick. The first enforcer burst through the frame, his silenced pistol leading the way. Do-kyun didn't hesitate. He didn't use the refined techniques of a dojo, he used the desperation of a man who had seen his own grave. He stepped into the attacker's guard, swinging the heavy skillet with a sickening crack against the man's temple. As the first man crumpled, a second lunged from the hallway. Do-kyun felt a hot graze of a bullet against his shoulder, a reminder of his mortality, but the adrenaline was a more potent antidote than any charcoal broth. He tackled the enforcer into the kitchen table, the wood splintering under their combined weight. They rolled on the floor, a chaotic mess of limbs and gasps. Do-kyun saw the man's eyes widen as he recognized the face of his former master. In that moment of hesitation, Do-kyun delivered a brutal, short-range strike to the man's throat. Nyamai moved like a shadow in the periphery, intercepting a third man at the window with a ferocity that made Do-kyun's heart skip. They weren't an army, they were two survivors in a corner. As the hallway fell silent and the remaining enforcers retreated to regroup, Do-kyun stood over the fallen men, his knuckles split and his breath coming in ragged gulps. He looked at his hands, bloodied, shaking, and devoid of diamonds. He had fought without his crown, and for the first time, he felt like he had actually won. The adrenaline that had sustained Do-kyun during the fight began to ebb, leaving behind a cold, hollow ache. He leaned against the damp kitchen wall, his knuckles split and his lungs burning. On the floor, the enforcers lay incapacitated, men he had once commanded, now reduced to obstacles he'd had to overcome with his bare hands. He looked at Nyamai, who was methodically wiping the screwdriver she had used as a ward. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a fresh pair of red rubber gloves, pulling them on with a crisp, snapping sound. Do-kyun watched her, the sight of the crimson latex triggering a memory of the crawlspace. You're still wearing them, he rasped, his voice a ghost of its former authority. The fight is over. There is nothing left to clean. Nyamai paused, her hands frozen mid-adjustment. She looked down at the gloves, then back at him. The flickering neon light from the street reflected in the smooth, red surface. You think these are about the dust in your penthouse, Beck? You think I wear these because I'm afraid of a little dirt? She stepped closer, the red gloves stark against the dimness of the room. I've worked in your world for 3 years. I've seen the way you look at people, and I've seen the things you've ordered done. I saw the blood on the floors before I ever arrived to mop it up. These gloves weren't for your house. They were for me. The realization hit Do-kyun with more force than the enforcer's kick. The red gloves weren't a badge of servitude, they were a barrier. She had worn them to keep his world, the violence, the greed, the casual cruelty of the syndicate, from touching her skin. While he had lived in controlled wealth, she had lived in a state of moral quarantine. She had stayed invisible not because she was small, but because she refused to be contaminated by the filth he had mistaken for power. I didn't want your money to leave a stain, she whispered, her voice softening. I wanted to be able to go home to this neighborhood and still recognize the hands I used to hold my brother's memory. Do-kyun looked at his own hands, uncovered, bloodied, and trembling. For years, he had believed he was the one who was clean, the one who was superior because he sat at the top of the pyramid. But looking at Nyamai, he saw the true antidote to the poison in his veins. It wasn't just the charcoal broth or the time away from the tonic, it was the realization that a soul could remain untainted even in the heart of a monster's den. He reached out, his fingers hovering near the red latex, a silent acknowledgement of the distance between them. He wasn't just a sick man anymore, he was a man who finally understood that the only way to be truly powerful was to keep your hands clean of the very things he had spent his life accumulating. The heavy iron doors of the syndicate's boardroom didn't whisper open, they groaned, forced by a man who no longer cared for the silent theatrics of power. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of expensive cigars and the premature celebration of a coup. Han Eol sat at the head of the table, perched in Do-kyun's chair with the awkward posture of a usurper playing king. He was mid-laugh, gesturing to the council leader, until the sound died in his throat like a strangled ghost. Do-kyun stepped into the light. He wasn't the man they remembered. The tailored silk had been replaced by a simple, dark work jacket, and his face bore the fresh scars of the shadow sector. He looked thinner, his skin pale from the lingering traces of arsenic, but his eyes held a terrifying, lucid gravity that made the men around the table recoil. He didn't look like a boss, he looked like a reckoning. "You look disappointed, Han Eol," Dukyun said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that cut through the sudden silence. "Did you think the poison would do the work for you? Or did you think your men were enough to finish what you started?" Han Eol scrambled to his feet, reaching for the handgun tucked into his waistband. "You're a dead man walking, Beck. Guards. The guards are watching the monitors, just as I am," Dukyun countered calmly. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, battered USB drive, the digital heart of Nimai's ledger. He tossed it onto the polished mahogany table. It slid across the surface, stopping inches from Han Eol's trembling hand. "On that drive is 3 months of your life, Han Eol. Every meeting in my garden, every spiked dose of my tonic, every cent you funneled from the docks. It's not just my evidence. It's the council's." Dukyun looked toward the elder council members. "He didn't just betray me. He's been skimming from your shares to fund his takeover. He's been selling your routes to the Russians. He didn't want a brotherhood, he wanted a monopoly built on your corpses." As the room erupted into a low, murderous murmur, the monitors on the wall flickered to life. Nimai had done her work well. The invisible ghost had captured everything. High-definition footage of Han Eol's meetings filled the screens, his own voice echoing through the speakers, mocking the very elders he was now begging for protection. Dukyun didn't stay to watch the execution. He had no need for the blood or the screams that were sure to follow. He turned his back on the throne he had spent a lifetime building, realizing that the most powerful thing in the room wasn't the men in the chair, but the truth brought to light by the woman who cleaned the floors. He walked out of the boardroom, leaving the monsters to devour their own, stepping into the hallway where the air finally felt clean. 1 year later, the snow fell over Seoul, but it didn't look like ash anymore, it looked like lace. Baek Dukyun stood on the sidewalk of the shadow sector, dressed in a simple wool coat that bore no designer label. He wasn't flanked by black SUVs or men with earpieces. He stood alone, holding 2 cups of steaming ginger tea he'd bought from the corner bodega, the same shop where he'd once hidden in the back while his life was hunted. The heavy steel door of a nearby community center opened, and Nimai stepped out. She wasn't wearing a maid's uniform or red rubber gloves. She was wearing a thick sweater and an expression of tired, radiant satisfaction. She had spent the day teaching English and vocational skills to the neighborhood's immigrant youth, a program funded by an anonymous donor whose signature was simply a dark dragon-inked thumbprint. He handed her the tea. Her hands were bare, warm, and clean. The council reached out again, Dukyun said quietly, his voice now devoid of the gravelly edge of the underworld. "They want the great dragon to return. They say the streets are chaotic without a king." Nimai took a sip of the tea, the steam curling around her face. She looked at the men who had once been a monster, the men she had dragged into a closet to save his soul. "And what did you tell them?" Dukyun looked down at his hands, scarred, unadorned, and steady. "I told them the dragon died in a crawlspace on New Year's Day. I told them I've found a more difficult job." "Oh. And what's that?" she teased, a small smile playing on her lips. "Being human," he replied. They walked together down the cracked sidewalk, disappearing into the crowd of people Dukyun had once spent a lifetime overlooking. He wasn't a boss anymore, and she was no longer a ghost. They were just 2 people who had survived a storm, realizing that while power can build a fortress, only humanity can make it a home. True power is not found in the ability to command others, but in the courage to truly see them. Baek Dukyun had an empire, but he was dying of isolation and arrogance. Nimai Calder had nothing but her integrity, and that is what saved them both. Sometimes, the person you consider part of the furniture is the only one with the perspective to see the rot in the walls. The bravest thing a powerful person can do is let go of the crown and let someone save them. In a world that demands ruthlessness, the most powerful act of rebellion is choosing to be seen, to apologize for blindness, and to value a clean soul over a golden throne.